Thank you, Michaela. So yeah, we were going to go ahead and do introductions, and then we have some prepared questions. And at 1 o'clock, we're going to ask for you to take a break and get into small groups and maybe do some debriefing, and then come back at 1:12 and kind of wrap it up with you all offering some questions and having the panelists an opportunity to respond to those questions. And so I want to go ahead and turn it over to Stephanie, then Alyssa, and then Scott.
Okay, hello, my name is Stephanie Bostwick. I'm Blackfeet and I work at Northwest Indian College at Lummi Nation. Our program that we have is an engineering program that's focused on renewable energy and energy sovereignty for tribes. So with that, we've applied for a lot of grant funding to do microgrid feasibility studies, to install solar, and to look at incorporating more renewable energies, as well as microgrid infrastructure to move our community toward energy sovereignty.
Hello, everybody. My name's Alyssa Macy. I'm a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, Oregon. I grew up on the Warm Springs Indian Reservation, and Patu and I are fellow tribal members, so it's really great to be with her in the same space. I was really fortunate, I think, to grow up in a home with a parent that spent a lot of time talking to me about treaties. And as a child, you know, and I'm talking little, like 6, 7, treaties are not really something that you're kind of comprehending at that point. You want to play outside, float around in a tube in the river, you know, ride your bike type of thing. But my father planted a seed, and that seed around treaty rights and sovereignty really has been my guide for the work that I do here at Washington Environmental Council, Washington Conservation Voters as a CEO, but how I choose to live my life and the things that are really important to my core. And I have been living here in Seattle for 2 years. I'm a guest in this territory and really feel honored to be amongst such beautiful cultures. I'm learning so much. I get to spend a lot of time up in Lummi, so very powerful community, and just really having the opportunity to learn about the tribal nations in this area, and to reflect on the things that I'm learning here in comparison to what I've learned in the context of my own community. Prior to being the CEO here, I served as a Chief Operations Officer for the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. I managed 5 different branches, natural resources being one of them. So I spent a lot of time working with really smart people, working in the natural resources space. And I always felt that that was the place where I saw the exercise of treaty rights on a day-to-day basis. So really excited to be here with you all. Thank you so much for the invite. And it's been a lot of fun just to see everybody in the comments.
So yeah, we are trying to bring up some slides right now. Hopefully we can do this.
I'm showing my lack of technical expertise there. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good morning. This is Scott Schuyler. It's an honor to be here, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the infrastructure on the Skagit, energy infrastructure, and to give you a little bit of history about the tribe and a little bit about our history here. I've fished the Skagit River for the last 41 years, just as my ancestors have since time immemorial. It was a mere 166 years ago when my ancestor Patea signed the Treaty of Point Elliott with the United States on a cold January day in 1855, reserving the right to fish, hunt, and gather, and in fact, the right to continue to even exist. I'm sure he could not have foreseen what would happen to our people in the period from 1855 until now. I'm sure he could not have seen the changes that our people would have experienced during that very same period. how the sacred river named after our people, our waters that were once overflowing with millions of salmon returning annually and are now often bare, and how our culture and way of life could be put at risk by this change. Every culture has the sacred areas that are important to each individual culture. To our people, the most sacred areas are the Upper Skagit Valley, the Upper Skagit Gorge Canyon, the bringer of life, the river. Our people believe that Squidilich, Indian power, was drawn from the spiritually clean cold waters of the Skagit and the gorge, and our people gave us the, and our stories of origin, beginning with the transformer Dokwabuth, coming to the Upper Skagit Valley, made conditions right for our people. We believe in a transformers. We believe in guardian spirits that gave us the ability to communicate with the animals. Our explanation of how we got here, grouse, the guardian spirit grouse, populated our villages, including the villages at Mount Vernon, Cedar Woolley, Burlington, New Halem. 100 years ago, a mere 100 years ago, 3 generations of Upper Skagit, the city of Seattle came to our river as an extension of manifest destiny, if you would, believing that the area was unoccupied, available for exploitation. And that set in motion a century of degradation that has occurred on our people through the construction and operation of that massive hydroelectric project. We know today many of the obvious effects, the desecration and the inundation of cultural sites, including TCPs, the exclusion of our people to these most sacred areas in our religious belief system, known to us as the Valley of the Spirits, or Skyu, which is our word for ghosts, or the altering of habitat in our precious salmon and wildlife populations. I've lived long enough to see the large salmon runs dwindle, and in my lifetime I've saw the last tribal directed fisheries for wild spring Chinook in 1988, the last wild summer fall Chinook fishery and chum salmon fishery in 2007. Today, our fisheries are a fraction of what they once were and are relegated to a few hatchery programs for the most part. And now our tribe is actively working with the city of Seattle to understand the impacts and the role of hydro can now play for a better tomorrow for the Skagit. A little bit about this picture. This is an Upper Skagit family on the Skagit River. The transformer Dokwabuth, that's again how it explains creation from our perspective.
Scott, sorry to interrupt you, but we can't see the slides.
Oh, you can't see the slides?
Mm.
Okay,
But
that's.
I feel like you're visually telling the story though. So like if you don't, if it doesn't come up, I think that's totally fine too.
Okay, let me try one more time. I thought I did the share screen, sorry. Again, my, let's see. How's that? No? Well, I apologize about the technical difficulties. Won't be able to share the screen. So that would conclude my intro. Sorry. You got me back.
No worries. Yeah, no, I felt like just when you said in the picture, that was the only time I think any of us noticed there was no picture. But I feel like your storytelling ability, like we don't really need a picture.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Apologies.
So I'll just go ahead and jump right into it, and I will go in the same order. Stephanie, if you want to take this on, can you offer examples of how energy infrastructure relates to tribal sovereignty and or self-determination?
Absolutely. So, currently most tribes don't really have any say over how their energy is generated, how it's distributed, who's prioritized. They don't have power over outages, how long those last. So, energy infrastructure, a lot of it's owned by utilities and other organizations, and tribes don't have a lot of say in that, or even what infrastructure exists on their lands. So, it's important from a sovereignty perspective for people to be able to own their own generation, make those decisions about their generation and their transmission and distribution, and be able to prioritize different facilities and homes in ways that they decide. And not only that, just getting energy to everyone. Even at Lummi Nation, there are households that are just not connected to anything. And it's really important that we get that infrastructure in place, and that we be able to have some control over that.
Thank you. Alyssa, would you like to speak more on tribal sovereignty and self-determination in relation to energy infrastructure?
Sure. A couple of things. Tribal self-determination is the belief that tribal nations should employ their own governance and make their own decisions on issues affecting their own people. And if you think about this, it is a return to the political independence that existed prior to colonization. We had laws, we had forms of governance pre-contact. When I think about energy infrastructure, I reflect on our current reality, and our current reality is that this country has one of the highest energy consumptions in the world. President Biden committed to cutting greenhouse gas emissions and made a commitment to achieve a net zero economy no later than 2050. And that's a huge commitment, right? And the development of these renewable energy projects across the country to a great extent are tied to Indian country, because a lot of this energy and the ability to develop energy projects are sitting on tribal lands. And this is really important, and it's also something that we should be really mindful and concerned about. It's important because it is an empowering mechanism. When you look at some of these projects, they represent an opportunity for new sources of income for tribes, especially when tribal communities are having impacts from climate change to their traditional subsistence lifestyles, and in many cases are living in extreme poverty. And we know that about 14% of Native American households actually lack access to electricity across the country. So when we're thinking about advancing clean energy projects here in the United States, we are looking in many cases at tribal lands. We are also looking at land that is not necessarily within the boundary of a reservation, but has a cultural significance to a tribal nation. And there are some examples here, many examples here in the state of Washington, where energy projects and siting are impacting places where people hunt, gather, in particular like roots along the Columbia River with the Yakima Nation. So there's opportunity, and there's also a need to move and in this space with a lot of intention and being very open about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and ensuring that tribal sovereignty is at the center of these conversations, especially when we're looking at tribal lands, and that we are ensuring cultural integrity as we go forward. So amazing and interesting work that's happening across the country in energy as it relates to tribal nations.
Thank you. Scott, did you have some thoughts that you wanted to offer to this question?
Sure, thank you. From our perspective, self-determination and sovereignty, are akin to the tribe having the ability to take care of ourselves and our members. Currently, our little reservation here in Cedar Woolley has gone without power, as an example, for days at a time, because we just don't have the infrastructure, the abilities and capabilities. And so that should be the overall goal, is to make sure that tribes are self-reliant, and we're not relying on utilities or federal agencies to look after ourselves. And that's ultimately our goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So yeah, I'll go ahead and just move right into the next question. What are some of the most, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, but what are some of the most pressing concerns and interests folks in your community have about hydro and renewables, Stephanie?
Well, hydro obviously has a major impact on the salmon population, and Lummi Nation is completely dependent on that salmon population. So, getting off of hydro and being able to look at other renewables is just really important. I think not only to this community, but the other surrounding communities. it's an equal effect on everyone, and you know, it affects other populations as well. So, you know, hydro is not the cleanest renewable energy out there. And while there are issues with other types of renewables, I think at some point it's sort of picking the lesser of evils, picking the thing that has less of an impact on the community, and helps the community with resilience with those outages, and you know, moves us forward.
Thank you. Alyssa, do you have some thoughts you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, to everything that was just said, you know, hydro does have an impact on salmon populations. And I look at this also from a cultural side and a spiritual side, because when we start talking about salmon, Waikanash, we are talking about our relative. We are talking about a piece of who we are as Indigenous peoples, as Native peoples from Inchiwana. It is fundamentally a part of us, and we are a part of them. And so when we start looking at these hydro projects and how they are impacting salmon runs across this region, in the past, let's talk about the Dalles Dam. The Dalles Dam was built along the Columbia River, and when those gates shut, it flooded Celilo Falls. That is a place of my people that no longer exists anymore. It was silenced. And there are elders in our community that remember that, that talk about that. And as a Wasco woman, for me to go to the Columbia River and stand along those banks, I know that there's something missing from who I am as an Indigenous people. I feel it in my core. It's like you're grieving for something that you've never known, but you know that it should be there, right? And so when we're talking about salmon and we're talking about hydro, there is a need to really think about the cultural aspect of it for Indigenous peoples and take that into account. We are very numbers driven in this society. We want to talk about the science. We want to talk about, you know, the financial impact. We want to talk about those things. Yes, and we also need to talk about the cultural impacts. What does cultural genocide mean? You know, I think about this quite a bit. What does cultural genocide actually mean? You know, it is a consistent taking away of traditions, values, language, and other elements that make people distinct, one group of people distinct. So when I think of hydro and all of these renewable projects and their potential impact and their impact on our traditional values, on our traditional ways of life, on our ability to be who we are as Indigenous peoples, it is in fact another element of cultural genocide. So how do you account for that within the development of projects, especially any infrastructure project, like a roads project, a dam project, a solar project, right? Those are things that we attempt to address through the National Historic Preservation Act and some other federal laws, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that consultation, free prior informed consent, all those elements of working together and ensuring that you're not violating treaty rights and violating your treaty, because we as Indigenous peoples that have treaties, it's our treaty, it's also the federal government's treaty, it's your treaty too. So we want to make sure as we go through these projects and we pursue and move towards you know, energy, a world where we're not killing ourselves, we have to think about all those things, and it's going to take all of us. So I really feel like the impacts that we take account of in a lot of the project development we do across the spectrum of types of projects often fails to take into account traditional, cultural, and ecological knowledge. And that is something that we need to be really thinking about, taking that into account, talking about it, and also recognizing that when we're talking about sacred sites, especially Indigenous people's sacred sites, we may not want to share that information with you, and that should be okay. We should not have to tell you where our ancestors are buried, where those things are that that are feeding our souls and who we are as Indigenous peoples, it needs to be respected. And that is really something that our tribal historic preservation officers are tasked with, our elders in our communities are tasked with. But how do we bring that into processes in a respectful manner to ensure that we are not impacting like who we are as Indigenous people? So it is a lot to think about when you really start to get into it, but the impacts are real. They are things you can touch. They're things you can study. You can put numbers behind them, do all that. And they're things that we feel. They're things that we carry. And they are part of, some of those things are a part of our very essence, our health and well-being as Indigenous peoples.
Wow, that was pretty good. Tough to follow. You know, I think the message that we have, let me back up. There's 5 hydroelectric dams on the Skagit. Roughly 40-something% of the watershed's been cut off. There's a cost for hydro, and we want people to understand that there is a cost for hydro. Who ultimately bears that cost? Is it the salmon that are sacred and precious to us? Or is it the tribe affected by the operation and the existence of hydropower? Who ultimately is responsible for bearing this burden and this cost? You know, one of the things that my counterpart just said, you know, we shouldn't have to tell everybody where our cultural sites are, where our significant sites are. You know, we've been forced to do that to try to preserve and protect, and that is a cost that the tribe has accrued, having to show everything and share our culture, you know, with the end game of trying to protect our culture, what's left of it. You know, right now, 100 years into hydro on the Skagit, we just don't know what the impacts are still. And I said this earlier, we don't know what the impacts are on the salmon. We do know what the impacts are on us directly. You know, the river's been taken. You know, we know how it feels for an Upper Skagit to see our dewatered river named after our people. We know these impacts. We know what it's like to be excluded to these sacred areas. How do we address that? We don't know yet. You can't put a price tag on these things, our culture, our resources. No amount of money will make things right when things have been taken to this extent. And that's the message that we have to the public, is that just to understand that it's not as easy as flipping on the switch, and that there is other costs that people should be aware of for the power that we all utilize. So thank you.
Can I just quickly follow up to what Scott was talking about? Because you brought up the word cost a lot. And I think that a lot of times, you know, utilities look at cost as the dollar value. And I've been told so many times, why would you want to bring renewable energy out to Lummi Nation when hydroelectric power is cheap or inexpensive? And that, you know, thinking of cost in terms of dollars purely is just not the right way to look at it, because those costs to the people, to the communities, are more than a financial cost. And so we have to look at that and not just how many dollars does this cost people, because it's much bigger than that.
Yeah, I feel like you all are really touching, or not even touching, but diving deep into like a lot of really important themes. And definitely, like, you know, we've seen how economics had been used as like the maximum, and now we have like these giant, large scale, overly engineered areas as a result of this idea of a maximum. And now, you know, we've seen some other a lot of change in that 100 years, but like, yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that. I think I should stop there, but it is really emotional for me to listen to us really even relate to each other on this, just recognizing that a lot of our experiences, you know, are happening and felt within such diverse nations, but also with a lot of that common, you know, we all value like a lot of similar things around just like the ecosystem well-being and how our community really connects to that. But I did want to share just really quick, like a carving I made a few years back. And if you've been around me, I might have shared this before, but it kind of went with what some of Scott was talking about, like having kind of protectors. And I had made this mask, and I finished it after experiencing discrimination and witnessing anti-Blackness and transphobia, and I just wasn't okay with all those isms. And then I carved this wolf, finish, and it like was kind of all about protecting and people having a right to be in a space and have really help to shape and create that space. So not just inclusion, but really truly be a part of it. And I just wanted to share it because I feel like it goes with some of the themes that we're talking about of like losing a river. Gosh, that's really big. I feel like that's dramatic. Like just, you know, like we talked about it a little bit, but like looking through the eyes of a treaty signer, geez, there's no way that people would have ever been okay with that. And so, you know, tribes really have been at the forefront of trying to advocate for these spaces and really having meaningful outcomes. Like a lot of people don't realize, and it's, you know, becomes with those racist tropes, but there would not be famine if there weren't Native people here. And one of the big connections that I often talk about is someone, I feel like I'm kind of displaced into this urban area. I prefer to be in my traditional territories, but for whatever reason, the creator has me here. But with that said, I feel like I kind of see and feel this issue from two different sides, which is, you know, the direct impact to my community, and as, you know, was so well described by the panelists, what that can look and feel like, you know, to have our largest trading center so impacted. And then on the other side, I see all this going into big companies who pollute our water. And then you see tribes again trying to be like, hey, these like water quality standards need to be better. Like they need to not be giving people cancer. And so that's where I think some of our connection to some of the folks here, you know, within like heavily industrialized communities, like I'm within the Duwamish Valley as well. But that cheap power is also heavily polluting. And so we're really experiencing it in multiple ways. And I just wanted to kind of draw a connection, but I kind of feel like that's partly what that mask is talking about too, just like that right to well-being that we all have. But yeah, I thought I would go ahead and go another round with this last question that we had prepared. There are assumptions about equity and social justice, both in the environmental and climate sector. And oftentimes it's assumed that Native folks are included in this. What is your experience with, I would say, advocating for social justice or equity kind of in the context of Native and tribal community? Stephanie, sorry, I keep putting you on the spot first.
That's okay. Yeah, I think that, you know, the conversations are starting to happen. When they do include Indigenous communities, I feel like it stops at a conversation. And, you know, the government is slowly starting to put together, you know, grant funding that's competitive for tribes. But I think, you know, ultimately the conversations need to happen more and have follow-up so that they're not just conversations, because people talk a lot about impacts, but we don't see any change happening. You know, you look at the Elwha River dam removal. How long ago was that? How many dams have been removed since then? None. So it's, you know, we have these powerful moments or conversations, and then the follow through, the follow up on that really doesn't seem to exist. And I think even in terms of, you know, infrastructure and sovereignty, you know, we shouldn't be having to competitively apply for grant funding to get that infrastructure in place for tribes. The government owes it to every tribe to give them that sovereignty and to help assist with that. So why are we all, you know, having to go out there and prove our case? I mean, I would think that the case is there for every single tribe in the United States. And why do we have to go to the government and say, here's the plan we have, and here's what we're thinking, and do you think you could help us with a little bit of funding for that? And, you know, a lot of the funding it feels like a drop in the bucket. You know, you get a solar array on one building, and I mean, that's potentially 2 years of time that you've put into applying for a grant and getting that, you know, in place. And it's like, we need so much more, and we need it yesterday. And by yesterday, longer than that. But you know, it's just I think it's just the conversations exist right now, and it sort of stops there. I don't think that people are really acting on the conversations that are happening.
Thank you. Alyssa, do you want to follow up with some items on that?
Sure. Lots of thoughts in this space. I'm going to start out by something my dad used to tell me when I was growing up. Treaties are the supreme law of the land. The supremacy clause of the Constitution establishes that the Constitution, the federal laws made pursuant to it, and treaties made under its authority constitute the supreme law of the land and thus take priority over any conflicting state laws. Important to put that out there. Because when we talk about the I in BIPOC, that means something. It really means something. And what I have seen in my experience here in Seattle in particular, but in the state, is that we talk about BIPOC a lot, but we don't actually really talk about that I. And it's complicated, right? It's a really complicated thing. Here in the state of Washington, between 1864 and 1856, there were 7 treaties that were negotiated. The state of Washington wasn't even a thing until 1889. So these 7 treaties that are here predate this state, and they are the law of this land. And so tribal rights codified to hunt, fish, and gather, education, health, all of those things mean something. So when we are looking at organizing, especially organizing amongst different groups, people of color across the state, if you are not working with the I, you've got an opportunity to grow. There are 29 federally recognized tribes here. There are 2 tribes that have reserved treaty rights that are outside of Washington, and even a tribe like Warm Springs, where Patu and I are from, we have UNA, usual and custom rights on the Cowlitz River. We can go and get fish for smelt. And so the reason that I bring this I up is because it's important to understand that you have many definitions under that I. It's not just one, it's an and, right? You have federally recognized tribes, you have state recognized tribes, non-federally recognized tribes, and you have indigenous peoples who have settled in this area that may be from other geopolitical regions of the world. And I think about this a lot because I spent a decade advocating within the United Nations systems with indigenous peoples from around the world. And honestly, it blew my mind. When I started doing that work, it blew my mind because I saw myself in people that look very different than what you think of Native people looking like or indigenous people looking like, right? Here in this country, the media has sort of packaged up what Indian identity is. So you kind of, as a kid, I watched a lot of cowboys and Indians movies when I was growing up as a kid. So I was like, everybody looks like a Plains Indian. We don't. And so kind of growing in my understanding what it means to be indigenous. And so when we're doing organizing, we really have to be mindful of the complexities of the I and how we are organizing around that. When I was a chief operations officer for Warm Springs, one of the things that I saw was a lot of folks talking about BIPOC, never once came and talked to us, never came and talked to the council, never came and talked to community members. There were nonprofits that would occasionally write a grant and then call us up and say, hey, we got a grant to work with you. And I'm like, good luck with that. We're not working with you because that is not how it works. So there is a real opportunity to grow in this space. And to really develop meaningful relationships with tribal nations and indigenous peoples, recognizing that this is complex work. And there's a lot of work that we as indigenous peoples also need to do to be more welcoming, to see ourselves in people that are coming from Central and South America who are our people. They are indigenous people, but they speak a different language. They may speak Spanish or they may speak some other Portuguese, right? But they're still indigenous peoples. They share many of the things that make us indigenous peoples, that connection to land, culture, language, all of those pieces. So it is a complex organizing to do, and I'm not seeing a ton of it. There's some of it. And it's really a place where there's some opportunity to grow and do better. And I think at the fundamental essence of it, what this starts out with is relationships. If you want to make friends up in Lummi, you go up to Lummi, you go to Stamish. You know, if you want to make friends, you go to the community. Like, I'm still trying to go to Macau because I want to visit. It's so bad. It's like on my bucket list of places to go, still closed. You go to Yakima, you go to their treaty days, you know, you go and see the community and you get to know the people. Our communities are like that. We want to know, especially if you're an Indigenous person, we want to know who your mama is, who your grandma is on both sides of the family, all your cousins, you know, did you play basketball? Like, do you powwow? Are you fishing? All of those things. It's relationship based. And so we really have this opportunity to get to know one another in a way that's very meaningful and to bring our movements together and to be more powerful. I will also say that the B is really important too. It's all really important, but what I'm seeing is an absence of people at the table in the traditional, well, there's absence of all people color, right? In the environmental, in the sort of like historically white-led organizations, which I run. How do we start to set the table that's more representative of the communities we say we represent, that has to not only include people from Seattle, we have high density energy projects like Patu reference, but places like Yakima, places like the Tri-City, folks up in Whatcom County, people on the coast, Vancouver, areas where energy projects and fossil fuel expansion continues to try to take hold. You got to bring the right folks to the table. The end of the day, this is all about getting to know one another, and also recognizing that we can have different opinions on how to get from point A to point B. We can disagree and we can still stay in community. I think at the end of the day, we all have a desire and a hope to ensure a future for all of us. I think about that all the time. What is the world going to look like in 50 years? I want to be a part of helping to change that with everybody, not just tribes, with everybody. So for me, it's always an and. It's like and it's really hard work. It is so hard. And like, I'm really tired most of the time, like need lots of naps, but it is just like one of those things that I'm thinking about at all times. Like, how do we bring people together? Especially right now with COVID, it's super hard to be in person, but it's just a really important part. So there is a growth edge for all. Including the organization that I am tasked with running with. Like, we know we have a growth edge, we know where we need to do better. And it's a conscientious commitment that you choose to do every day. It's an every day, all the time type of work.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Yeah, you're getting a lot of love in the chat. And I did want to flag, and now this is kind of random, but somebody, Ben Pfeiffer, shared that they used to travel across Ichimana at night and remember their mom pointing at the tribal members harvesting fish or drawing attention. So yeah, it's really great to have you here with us, Ben, especially for those of us that didn't get to witness the falls. Like, I do feel like for me, just anybody that keeps and holds that memory, it helps to inform kind of whatever is within my DNA that also likes to carry those stories, even though I might not be a firsthand witness. I'm curious, Scott, do you have anything that you would like to add about ways that Native efforts could become more visible, or just shouting out efforts that are taking place too?
Well, I just think I'd like to add, I can't agree more about the building of the relationships is the key. We come from a society, our tribe, very secretive, if you would, and not wanting to be part of the mainstream. And so it's a difficult time for us to transition into building those relationships out there to get the work done that we need to do. We're very fortunate that we live in a time period right now where these issues are being talked about. Social injustice, cultural trauma. In fact, when I was talking to some folks from a city down south recently, one of the things that I thanked them for was, thank you for bringing this language to us, because in our language, we didn't have these words, we didn't have these phrases. we knew what was wrong and what was occurring, but we did not have the words to convey to you what you were doing to us. And so we're at that stage right now where we're building relationships, just as my counterpart said, and we hope to have a better tomorrow. I've lived through, the treaty times here on the Skagit. I've seen the state fish and game, harass our tribal members for fishing. I've seen many bad things occur to our people for continuing to fish, but we're not going here. We've been here 10,000 years. We're going to continue to practice our way of life, and hopefully we'll be here for another 10,000 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to mention and flag something Michaela dropped in the chat. If folks have any immediate questions that they want to ask, feel free to drop something in the chat. I wanted to mention, and y'all just get my mind spinning, I totally didn't need any more coffee. I probably will drink more later though. But for me, like going to affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, what helped me realize that, the diversity, I guess, that there was diversity in Indian country. When I was a little kid, I thought we were the only Native Americans left, aside from a few other tribes. I didn't know. And sorry, but there aren't really history books that tell our stories to the extent that we have stories. And I was always like, they're writing in past tense all the time. I'm pretty sure these Native Americans are still around. But I had like a funny experience when I was pulling with the Polar Dye Canoe family with the Quinault Canoe Society. And I came into Makah Nation and definitely needed a shower, and showed up at a little kid's birthday party, and it felt so familiar to me. And I just went in there, used the shower, ate some food, took off. Later realized it was my old babysitter's house. So I'm like, weird. And when I was a kid, I had thought he was from Alaska. And so, yeah, just kind of some of those like kind of funny experiences, especially later in life, to like once my, being able to get out in the world. And that is a privilege to be able to do that. But it was one of those fun things that kind of speaks to the importance of relationship building. And one of the things that came up for me also was relational accountability. And that's something I'm still kind of learning about and working through. But I feel like that concept kind of helped change my mind on a few things and maybe figure out how I could be engaging in a more healthy way. Cause like I was, like I mentioned, like really kind of, like trying to go through some things and keep thinking to myself, well, yes, I want to see our people continue to lead in this space and have this change, like Alyssa especially helped to paint that picture. But I don't want it to become a space like where people are being recruited into the places that are harmful to us. Like it needs to be true and 100%. Yeah, so sorry, I did kind of spam y'all in the chat. I didn't mean to drop it when I did, but I wanted, we always get asked, how can we support Native folks? And so I just put some of my like top 10 places, and it can be like just even learning and advocating for some of the things we talked about. But it can also, I just dropped some things that I thought were interesting, including like Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission is doing some gathering of winter supplies and gifts for the Celilo village. And for me, that's just something that's really powerful, direct connection to a lot of the topics that we're talking about. But I'm going to go ahead. And thank you, Uraldi. And that one sort of is, how can we continue supporting you after the webinar? That was something that Uraldi wanted to know.
I guess I'll say it just briefly. One of the things, we get to ask that a lot. How do people help us? I think from our perspective, just educating yourselves and those around you about the tribes, particularly when it comes to regards to the treaties. That was a deal was struck, and we honored our end of the deal. And we get attacked constantly. People continually bring up, it's time to tear down the treaties, this type of stuff. And Well, it doesn't work that way. We're never going to get our ancestral lands back. We're never going to get our cultural sites back. We can do what we can to protect them, but ultimately the tribes need to be afforded their ability to exercise their treaty reserved rights. And it's important to people to understand why, how we got there, and what the benefit for the non-tribal side is still there. The land is still there. It's being utilized, and understand that there was a cost. Our ability to exercise our rights. So that's a simple one, I guess, from our perspective.
Okay, any other comments from anyone? So I'm just kind of going down the list.
I was just going to add, Patu, we're around a holiday time, and there are a lot of incredible Indigenous artists out there, and incredible BIPOC artists across the board. So just, as you're thinking about that, I personally don't exchange gifts. It's been a thing for me for a really long time. It's just something I don't do. I do it when I want to do it, not during Christmas time. So that's just kind of how I choose to live. But, if you're out there, find the places where you can buy from people that are in your community that are making things, because it really is keeping that dollar in your community and supporting people and lifting them up at this time. So I encourage you to do that. And I always think about where I spend my money and what kind of businesses I choose to support. And I think that is a way to support not just Native people, but also all of us, right? Where, if I drive, because I don't do a lot of driving, but when I drive, I try to gas up at the gas stations that the tribes own. Like, I will drive all the way to past E to get there to spend my money at a tribally owned gas station, to do those sort of things. So just encourage you to, as we think about just the big picture, and how we choose to exist, is to support your local economy, especially now during the holiday season, because there's so many things out there to buy if you're buying for folks.
Super true. And, mine was kind of a shameless plug, but I put something that Alyssa had posted, which is like a raffle for helping to support, like our tribes have been without consistent potable drinking water. And there's been a lot of organizing efforts in multiple ways, but one of them being artists donating and doing a raffle. And I personally love a raffle. So in that big list, there are things, but I was curious if my tech support awesome people, Ben and Michaela, did y'all want to come on camera and read some questions? Because I just realized I've just been reading them. Or should I just keep reading?
Sure. There's a question from Christina who wants to know who says, in California, community choice aggregate utilities are becoming a thing, particularly geared toward solar and wind. Christina is wondering if any of you have had the experience with that model, and if so, are they any better than doing than what the big utilities are already doing when it comes to engaging with tribal people?
I can jump in. When in Warm Springs, where Patu and I are from, we live in Central Oregon. That is a high desert plateau, lots of sunshine. And for years, there have been these conversations about solar. And we have not been able to get our mind out of the go big or go home mentality, right? Like, we want to make the giant solar farm and we think we're going to power, half of Central Oregon. And I think where your question made me think of the scale of these projects. When I think of solar, I think of how can we provide energy to our elders? Can we start out there? And then can we scale up to provide energy to the community of West Hills or Greeley Heights, right? And I think our challenge has been, we get so big picture thinking, and then as Stephanie pointed out, you can't access the dollars to do that, right? You can't start a giant solar farm, the money's not there. We also don't have the expertise, because it's not just building it, it's having the laws within your own governance structure to be able to facilitate that. So I would love to hear from you, like talk to you about how do you look at these projects on a scale that really is maybe more intimate with the community and serving the community, instead of getting stuck in the mindset that we have to do these major projects. That has been a hindrance for Warm Springs. There are some projects that are using solar to clean water, because we do have a major water infrastructure issue in Warm Springs, and have had challenges getting potable water to homes and businesses. So can we scale these projects in such a way that they're smaller and more intentional to serve our community? Because that is an act of tribal sovereignty, right? When we are providing energy to our own people and we're creating those systems to do that, that is a way to lift our people up and to have a direct impact to community. So I am not a solar expert. There are not a lot of people in my community that are solar experts. So we also have to find and build relationships with people who can help us to bring those types of ideas to fruition. But I think the scaling up is the kind of where people's minds get stuck. And I'm like, can we just kind of look at a smaller version and give some energy to all of our grandmas and our aunties? Can we start there as a starting point? Thanks for that. That's a great question.
So yeah, we have a couple more questions. If we do answer those, we'll be running a little late. But Stephanie, I was curious, did you want to also answer that?
I think, what was said was great. And I guess what Alyssa was saying kind of brought me back to the previous question about what folks can do to get involved or support. And I think that policy is a big area where we need to see some change to be able to move forward on that large scale and move towards sovereignty, because there are policies in place that are either preventing that or slowing that process. So if folks are interested in getting involved in that conversation and helping move us forward, with respect to policy, I think that's something that would really help us move forward faster than we are at the moment.
The only thing I would add is, the tribe did do some work with one of the local utilities in the years past to look at the possibility of wind and solar. We've done some solar work here on the reservation, but unfortunately we live in Northwest Washington. And actually, if you can believe it or not, the wind, because of the wind studies, we determined that there wasn't sufficient enough wind to even run the turbines. And I'm going to jump to the question in the chat box there. There was a nuclear power plant proposed in the Skagit in the 1970s, which the tribe adamantly and successfully opposed, I think, in 1979.
Yeah, and for me, it's the legacy of Hanford. That is why I went into environmental science. I was at my tribe's senior center hearing a Yakima elder talk. And she talked about fighting cancer, and I just realized, okay, she, like, one of these days she's not gonna win. And so what does that look like? But I can't say I totally offer my perspective as a, like, I feel like what Scott just said about nuclear is more reflective of a tribe. Mine is more of my individual kind of fear of nuclear. I did want to mention one thing, using my privilege as the facilitator, pardon me, but just like operations, like I feel like what Alyssa said is like, wow, we have a lot of power in the Pacific Northwest, and we keep adding power to the situation potentially, but that doesn't mean that the dams are running in a fish-friendly manner, because the way power works, like a lot of times the wind will put a lot of power onto the grid, and then all of a sudden they're like spilling water, and then the water is creating like issues with oxygen and harming fish, and it could be potentially during critical migration times. And so it's also like, when do you plug in those electric vehicles? Are we kind of like operating within the system to really account for the peak demands and demand times and how those impact salmon? But I thought we could pause here, do our break, We were asking the audience to go ahead and go into a small group and take a break. Within that space, we wanted y'all to just kind of do some processing, and we'll come back to the other question that was in the chat. It looks like there's a lot of great questions coming into the chat too. And then we'll come back into the big group and get to more of these questions, but we want to give you a chance to debrief. And then also recognizing too that we're not facilitating this. So please do your best to step back if you're somebody that holds a lot of privilege and listen to BIPOC voices, but also please don't expect us to take care of your feelings. Like, we're already really impacted by these issues. And, you know, also I meant to mention earlier on, we also recognize this is a really hard time that we're all going through, but especially if you are from a Native and BIPOC communities, it's just not been the easiest time. So shake it out, take a break, come back. I would say, let's just come back at 1:12, like it, and then we'll send you out into a breakout group, or you might just choose to go get some more coffee or whatever it is. I'm curious if y'all are ready, the panelists, are you ready to get back into these questions? Ben or Michaela, do you have one queued up for us?
Right, let's see. Did you want to bring back the nuclear question that was posed to give other panelists a chance to
yeah. I thought you were saying nuclear, like the nuclear question, but it's like saying the nuclear question. So yeah, it's a question about maybe tribes' position on nuclear, and Scott and I kind of answered that, but curious if Alyssa and Stephanie had something they wanted to say about potential nuclear futures.
In my breakout group, we talked just really quickly about that. And one of the things, I guess I'm just curious, I'm not a nuclear expert, so somebody will probably have a smart comeback to this, but when we talk about Cascadia all the time and sort of the unstableness of this region, something like that just seems to like not quite fit. So that, and when we look at nuclear cleanup and the cost, who bears that cost, impact to the environment and people, it begs the question, is that the right way to go? What is the alternative, and what is the alternative in the long run? Because there is waste that is created from that, that we're going to be sitting here in the world forever, way beyond our time. And I just think that there's an opportunity to look at other sources of energy that are less, that will have less of an impact to this planet. And Cascadia, like I hear about it all the time. I'm like, why would we ever put a nuclear power plant if we're talking about Cascadia? Like,
good point. Big shout out to the volcanoes. Stephanie, do you have something you want to offer?
Sure. From a personal perspective, I am well versed in nuclear, and I will say that yes, it's not the cleanest renewable. I think that, you know, something here in the Northwest that doesn't get looked at enough is geothermal heat pumps. So not the big geothermal steam next to a volcano type of geothermal, but just residential. You know, you dig into the ground and you lay some piping and you use that heat exchanger for heating and cooling. And I think geothermal is one of the really consistent renewable energies that exists. And I think part of why it doesn't get talked about enough is because people aren't making enough money off of it, right? People are making a lot of money on solar. So that's like the big hot thing. And solar can definitely help us in the Northwest, but this time of year, not so much. So we need something that can kind of reduce those heating and cooling loads so that the solar and, you know, maybe micro hydro and wind, you know, those can supplement that. But geothermal would be a really consistent renewable to put in place that would, you know, really support residential needs without having a huge environmental impact.
Thank you. Yeah, and I wanted to mention, I think geothermal is exciting too for like greenhouses and stuff like that, especially as restoration work continues to be a thing. But personally, I like the idea of extended growth seasons and conditions too.
There was one question, like kind of back in the chat that Louise had posed around reparations. And so I know we'd kind of mentioned still like honoring treaty rights is still being a kind of a challenge, but maybe kind of pushing that question on what reparations might look like.
Are any of the panelists feeling strongly about that question? Land back.
Well, sorry, go ahead, Melissa. Well, I think, at least from my perspective, it would be a case by case basis on what the impact is, and it would be up to the tribe to determine what the impact is. I think history is really good from the non-tribal community on what their belief system is on how the tribes were impacted, and you don't want to go down that path, and it's very difficult for people that aren't tribal, that are impacting the tribe, to understand what these impacts are. So it puts a tribe in a very, very precarious position to explain impacts and understand, what they exactly mean to the tribe. And so, again, it would be a case by case basis to each individual tribe to identify and see if they were seeking reparations for impacts on the culture, on their treaty rights, or whatever was adversely affected. I don't know that answered the question, but that's all I have.
I think that really does. Stephanie, do you have any other thoughts on that?
I think what I would add to that is, that's the case for everything, right? You can't look at all tribes as a whole. You have to look at every tribe individually. When you're talking about reparations, when you're talking about renewable energy, when you're talking about anything, it's a lot of sovereign nations, and they all, have different perspectives and different needs and different impacts. So, you'd have to go to every tribe individually to find out what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think my answer might be a small part of it, but I do like the idea of supporting tribal museums, especially with just how so much of our cultures have been attacked. And then some museums do a great job of doing like family-friendly activities because they attacked our family units. And I don't mean to be like a downer in how I frame it either. But I know you can get the reciprocal membership and then go visit a bunch of museums. But I was at a museum the other day in the Seattle area, and I was like, how are they even charging us for this? Half of their collection is from our tribes. Like, this is bizarre. So I do think that there are some low hanging fruit like that. And like academia could start serving us. They could start having scholarships that actually cover the cost of schools, especially for tribes that are from within the area. But I would say also tribes from outside of the area, because they're displaced from somewhere into these locations. And so I think just having some more support, but I feel like it's a really big open-ended question too, I think. And like y'all already said, it's a nuanced answer, and can look, some of the things might be generally like, oh yeah, that works, but then other things might be really specific. I mean, for me, I'm even learning, about the tribes in Washington, and it's like, it's a lot. There's so much history just in this one location. But yeah, Ben, do you have a question ready for us?
Sure, there are a couple more questions in the chat. This question comes from Leandra, who wants to know, as a non-Indigenous person who is currently teaching K through 12 students about renewable energy, what are some main themes that you would like students to be taught to help them understand current and future issues?
I'm acting like a deer in headlights. I'm still thinking about the question. Does somebody else have any? Is someone else just like this ready to respond? I think we talked about some of them. I think the getting out of the good, bad binary is helpful. because a lot of that is like assuming, you know, a lot of us want to see ourselves as good, but there's a lot of bias steeped in wanting to see ourselves that way. And especially we have all talked about it a little bit, it's like there's a cost to every energy project. And something we haven't talked about is different types of energy stored, like whether it be a functioning forest, you know, like that's energy in there. And just kind of honor, and I think it was talked about, just kind of honoring the place. But anyways, I'm just trying to buy us a little time to think about that one.
That was so, just referencing your reference to other technologies, Graham asks, how comfortable are tribes using or beginning to rely on technology like batteries that are developed by large corporations like Tesla, or if that again is replicating too much reliance on corporations?
I mean, I will say, and I've thought about this a little bit, is that tribes, you know, are wanting to lead something different than what we have. And like sometimes that does take, you know, that leap with Tesla, like taking that leap with them. And so like we're talking about, well, we've removed like 2 dams, Elwha and the Condit. Who's next? Klamath, you know, like can we continue to build the science? And so I think tribes are definitely, you know, dynamic, and they're thinking about what would they do with their infrastructure. I think we're seeing that leadership. But that's me. I'm excited that the Nimipu and I dropped the story in there about their project using a battery. Does anyone have any thoughts about the previous question? And that's cool. Some Hannah has something about curriculum from the Wintu tribe, and my last name is Pitt. It's because I'm Pitt River. So thank you for shouting out my people. Sorry, the chat is distracting me. But yeah, I was excited about that.
I know we're open to new technology, again, by a case-by-case basis. And, you know, we're a small tribe. We don't have a lot of resources and a lot of infrastructure. And, you know, I think our long-term goal is to be as self-reliant as possible and turn to whatever green available technology or energies that are available. And again, you know, certainly nuclear, coal, are not the preferred option. Hydro currently is probably the cleanest option that is out there. Just again, understanding that that there is a burden and a cost on the resources and the tribe. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there are examples of like what Stephanie was talking about, like smaller scale dams that actually are, in the air quotes, like not as harmful as what we have now.
Yeah, there's microhydro, and people in Alaska use microhydro, and it, you know, it doesn't have that impact that the regular hydro does.
I think we're to the place in the meeting where do panelists have any like burning things that they feel like they should say before we say goodbye? I kind of feel like that's where we're at right now.
I have one thing that's burning that I want to say. The question earlier about how you can support tribes, I kind of want to return back to that. And what I am thinking about is is around the siting of future clean energy projects and being mindful of impact of siting issues. The Goldendale pump storage project that was proposed, that is not permanently denied, one of the permits was denied, sort of on hold, would have impacted a sacred site of the Yakima Nation. And that was like, there was a lot of back and forth when we were listening and hearing and talking to the tribe and providing comment as an environmental organization, like you need to listen to the tribe. And it's not a permanent no. It's sort of a pause right now in the project. And I think for allies, that is one of the things that you could do to be really helpful as we start to get into these projects. be mindful of process and be respectful of tribal nations and our sovereign rights and the impact to cultural resources, because you may not root dig, but I do. And that area is really important to Yakima Nation and other tribal nations, and it means something to us. And I think sometimes in these conversations about what can I put a number to in a scientific fact, you can't put a number to that, a cost to that, anything, because that's not what it is functionally. So really just encourage you, especially as we move forward with this commitment to, our future, our collective future, and all the things that we need to change to get there. We really need to be mindful of where we're citing, not just tribal nations and our usual and accustomed areas, but also where in urban areas are these projects being proposed and who are they impacting? Because typically it is people of color and lower income communities that this is impacting, and we should not have to carry that burden, that additional burden to everything else that we already have. So that's the one thing that I would ask folks on here is to be thinking about that at all times.
The thing that I would jump in and add there too is when state and federal legislation comes up that provides for the tribes to have an opportunity to have a voice, to have a seat at the table on particularly with energy, support that legislation. Those legislators that are putting forth the legislation that again puts the tribes at the table. Right now, currently, if you look at FERC proceedings, the tribes don't have prescriptive power. And in reality, that's where it should have started, is the tribes having the prescriptive power to, because we were the protectors of the environment, the landscape for thousands of years. And we need to get back to that point where at least we have a seat at the table. So thank you.
Stephanie, did you have anything?
Yeah, to kind of piggyback on that, being protectors of the land, Patu, in a previous conversation, you brought up the word resources, and looking at land and water and salmon and all of our relatives as resources is the wrong way to look at it from our perspective. So stop thinking about things as resources that can be used, because that's what's creating the damage.
Yes. And I just want to put a quick plug for just like having this sector change and having our people at every level, especially BIPOC people, especially formerly incarcerated, especially youth that are not being served by the school systems, just like pathways into careers. But again, having that environment really reflect a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, unsettling settler colonialism, just something that is different than what we have now. And in the sense that, a lot of this looks like the South, like segregation, like why, are we not seeing ourselves kind of in some of these jobs? And I know like Yakima Nation Heritage has a hard time getting like some of their credentials, like recognized at the state level for, I think it's line people. So like, yeah, opening up that door. But anyways, y'all have done an amazing job listening to us, and the panelists, amazing job educating. I know within like the first 3 minutes, my mind was already blown. And so thank you all so much for being a part of this and participating. And as an EJC, as a subcommittee, we're hoping to kind of continue like some of what we touched on today and continue that into our work and look forward to 2022.